This week's lecture is on dispersal. And dispersal is simply put as the getting of an organism as a species, an individual population from point A to point B. It is necessary to establish a viable population there. So for instance, in this example right here, the cattle egret, which is an African native, made it to the northeastern coast of South America in the late 1930s, but it had come over several times before. They'd been brought over several times before, but they didn't establish viable populations. But by the 1940s they had, and you can see from the diagram there that it pretty rapidly spread both north and south in just a few decades, till now here, especially in North America, we view it as a regular occurrence to see one of these things. This takes us to what's called Burink's law, and it's kind of a give-up position. Burink said that everything is everywhere. Things are always dispersing. Things have evolved on planet Earth to the point where they are always dispersing as adults, as juvenile, as not yet viable seeds or gametes, but it happens. And so dispersal is inevitable. But everything isn't everywhere in the sense that we don't find the species everywhere. What happens is the environment does the selection. So dispersal is inevitable regardless of ability. So in that particular photograph right there, you're looking at a brachiopod, and yeah, they spew out larvae into the ocean column, but you know they're endowed with a huge heavy yolk sac, and so they don't tend to go very far. And for that particular creature you're looking at, dispersal is not usually viewed as one of its strong suits, and yet it's found all over the northern hemisphere. There are two current views of dispersal, and this goes back to our dichotomy that we talked about much earlier in the course of ecological biogeography and historical biogeography. The ecological view is that, of course, there are multiple mechanisms to do this, and our biology friends can study them in intricate detail. And natural selection is actively favoring this dispersal to new locales. So there is always a more favorable locale that is different from their actual birthplace. This is contrasted with the historical view that, okay, all this stuff, it's always happening, but most of the time it amounts to nothing. And that's kind of true with most reproductive factors in biology. Your bullfrog gives birth to or bloops out thousands and thousands of eggs, but very, very few of them become successful reproducing adults themselves. And this is extended into the biogeographic world by this view that dispersal is everywhere, is constantly doing, and yet very few things actually successfully disperse to a new locality. It's very rare. And this view requires a perspective of events. So when it actually happens, it's an event, a historical event. And these things might be over huge temporal or spatial scales. So temporal, you need to look at fossils. Spatial, you need to look at thousands of kilometers, huge geographic areas. So this isn't just your garden variety ecology, it's macroecology or biogeography. So it's a historical science. Well, let's look at a couple of views or a couple types of dispersal. The first would be a jump dispersal. This is a long distance travel over regions where you don't have it. And so there's a dandelion. It has bloomed, it has dried out, the seeds are ready to be taken by the wind and moved over potentially a long distance to set up the next generation. Jump dispersal can be operating on larger scales, and so here's a slide of the recolonization of Krakatoa. Krakatoa was a volcanic island in Indonesia that blew up in the late 1800s, completely devastated, destroyed, removed the island. A second island grew up in the center of the crater, Anak Krakatoa, and it was monitored over many, many decades as animals and plants returned. And so in the graph here you see the number of species as the y-axis and then time as the x-axis. And notice the positive slope on all of these lines as monocots, things like palms, and then ferns and dicots, regular trees and plants that where most of us are used to. And for animals, birds, as they come back. And so all of them had to undergo a jump dispersal to get there because this island is highly isolated, separated from other land areas by vast amounts of sea. Besides jump dispersal, there is something that we call diffusion, which is a much slower range expansion. This is typically at the population level, and it follows jump dispersal. And so here the diagram is actually a chemistry diagram, the diffusion of a particular solute into, let's say, water. This could be Kool-Aid, lime Kool-Aid dissolved into water. There's a slow diffusion of that solute here. It's a good analogy for how dispersal operates in a slow pace in biogeography. So if we look at some examples here, we have the European starling. It's so common now, we view it as a native. It's a non-native exotic. But we can pinpoint the date it arrived in the 1890s from Europe. So there's the jump. Granted, it was a human-mediated jump. We brought it over accidentally. But since that time, there's been this slow but steady diffusion across North America. So one operating with the other. The house sparrow, you see several jumps. So look at these arrival times. 1852, New York City, 1871, San Francisco, 1886, Salt Lake City, and then slow but steady diffusion ever after. And now we view the house sparrow or the English sparrow as it's here, man. It's everywhere. The American muskrat, just to show an example for how this works, where our species are delivered to other parts of the world. The muskrat was taken to Europe for dual purposes of cleaning up swamplands, wetlands, but also rapid growth of an animal that they would want for pelts, fur. And you can see the jump to 1905 to get there, and then the diffusion ever after across Germany and Poland and up into Denmark, etc. The nine-banded armadillo, it's viewed by Texans at least as a Texan. It's native, we think, but it's not. It actually had its origins much, much earlier in tropical South America in jungles, and it has had a slow, steady dispersal northward, highly mediated by climate change as well. So you start seeing it in south-central Missouri as you travel south from Wisconsin, but my prediction is that you're going to start seeing it slowly but inexorably move north. Maybe someday it'll reach Wisconsin. The European rabbit is a particularly sad story of jump dispersal, then rapid diffusion. Of course, arrived with the early European settlers, the convicts, in Sydney Harbor in the late 1800s, and it has rapidly moved, and rabbits are known for their breeding success, and it has rapidly moved and diffused across all of Australia. A more historical view, this is Quercus, the genus for oaks, and here you're not looking at a human-mediated or human-caused invasion, but the slow and steady expansion of diffusion of oaks northward as the glacial ice from one of the more recent ice ages retreated. So the southernmost part of the UK, 9,500 years old, and then all the way up to Scotland by 6,000. There is something called secular migration. It's secular migration. This is range expansion that's so slow and or over such long distances that on the way there is speciation. There could be multiple speciations, such that by the time something has arrived in a new continent, a new area, or thousands of miles away, a different province, a different realm, it has speciated into different species, different forms. And of course you have the camel vicuna example there. Well, let's look at the movement mechanisms that we're talking about. First of all, the simplest one to understand is active dispersal. This is movement under your own power. Birds, whales, deep sea fishes, things like that. This is the way most people view dispersal because you can actively see it. And you can have some tremendous stories like this one here, the golden plover. And look, its breeding range, its winter range, if you sort of sum those up, this thing travels tens of thousands of miles yearly. Tremendous, tremendous amounts. And you got to think if it's migrating that far, that it can also it's just another hop, skip, and a jump to extend its range by a little bit of dispersal anywhere along the extremes or the edges of its range. More closer to home, things that most people know, the monarch butterfly. We have them, when you see them up here in Wisconsin, well, they are part of populations that are on their way back to 2 or 3 little valleys in Mexico, only to return the trip and do it again the other way next year. So an interesting group here of active movement. There's also passive dispersal. Once again, I show you the dandelion. These are organisms, plants, animals, fungi, etc., that are moved from place to place by external forces. And as you see there, wind, water, other organisms, etc. And seeds are a good example of this. Here, hold on, let me get this out of here. It shouldn't be there anyway. Seeds, and here you've got wind-blown fruits like the dandelion seeds. You have adherent fruits. These are all the things that have all kinds of little barbs and stickers and projections that help them stick into the fur, or for us, the clothing of other species, things like burrs. And so the plant will grow and produce seeds in one place, but by getting stuck in the fur of another organism, it can be transported miles away. You've got fleshy fruits, things that taste good, things that other animals eat. It travels through their digestive system, and by the time they poop it out, they could be miles away, dispersing that seed. And then finally, dehiscent fruits. There's a lot of plants that have evolved structures such that once they've dried out and they're disturbed, if they're touched or hit in some way, they launch these seeds. So they're thrown far away from the mother plant in order to propagate the next generation. A lot of times these will also have adherent structures on them so that they're launched. Let's say they'll land in the back of a deer that just disturbed the plant, and then that deer runs miles away only for that seed to fall off somewhere else and get planted elsewhere. Other examples, arthropods. If you look at these are all different large taxonomic groups of flies, spiders, butterflies, moths, so many different things, dragonflies, and where they have previously been found or collected in the sky. So these are thousands of feet in altitude, and small arthropods will routinely get picked up by winds, and they can be taken across hundreds, if not thousands of miles by passively sending them along their way. And then another example, just one that's closer to me, the Velella by the wind sailor. It's really basically just a jellyfish, but it has grown a sail on the top of the bell that sticks up. And so this one tends to sort of inhabit that area right at the water-air interface. Winds catch it, and they can be blown, as you see here, across entire ocean basins. Interesting, interesting group. And then finally, rafting. You have other objects, chunks of pumice, an old tree, garbage, etc. And if it gets into the oceans primarily, either living adults can get on it, or larvae can settle on it, and these rafts can go many, many miles that way. As far as rafting goes, it is part of the reading that I've included for this week, Joe Keel 1990. And then there's also a small short, and there's short paper too, on the Painted Lady. And so both of them have to do with different aspects of movement. So the Painted Lady is an active motion organism dispersal example. And then the Joe Keel paper has many, many examples of rafting.